Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today's story is about a respected minister who joined the U.S. Army and came to the attention of politician turned General Nathaniel P. Banks. General Banks brought this man, George Hepworth, onto his staff to become what amounted to a public relations arm of his staff with a special mission to support Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. So here's the reference. When the war began, 28 years old, Boston native Reverend George Hughes Hepworth served as pastor of the Church of the Unity in his hometown. His faith and his morality taught him that slavery was an evil. As the opening months of the war unfolded throughout that first year of 1861 into 1862, Reverend Hepworth struggled with staying in the pulpit in Boston versus wanting to join the great fight for freedom and to serve in the army. By 1862, he could wait no longer. When Abraham Lincoln put out that call for troops in the summer of 1862, he joined the 47th Massachusetts Infantry as the chaplain, naturally, and went with the regiment to Louisiana, arriving on the last day of 1862. Though he had only been in uniform for a short period of time, he wrote, "I had already begun to feel that my chaplaincy tended to confine rather than give ample scope to my desire for work." By this time, early on, he had met the overall commander of the Union forces in the region, that's Major General Banks. Hepworth requested and received from Banks an assignment as first lieutenant in a black regiment, the 4th Louisiana Native Guards. What a perfect place for Reverend Hepworth to bring to light all of his beliefs around the abolition of slavery. Banks, meanwhile, had a different idea, being one of the most prominent politicians in Massachusetts and probably knowing a little bit about Hepworth from his church in Boston. He realized that he could utilize Hepworth's zeal for anti-slavery and his abilities as an intellectual and as a writer. So Banks takes Hepworth onto his staff with special orders to investigate and report on labor practices in Louisiana. So, Reverend, now Chaplain Hepworth, now a staff member to Banks, brings his Harvard education, his Unitarian faith, and that ardent abolitionism to bear as he travels in Union-occupied Louisiana during the immediate aftermath of the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. During the remaining time of his enlistment in 1863, he chronicles plantation culture in a book that he comes out with before the end of 1863. The book is titled The Whip, Hoe, and Sword, the Gulf Department in 1863. In this book, he summarizes his experience, and he starts right off in the introduction where he says, quote, "If I talk a great deal of slavery, it is because I have seen a great deal of it. If I say no good thing of it, it is because I found no good thing in it. I learned to pity the slaveholder and the slave and to thank God and the genius of the age for the proclamation." To give you a flavor of what Hepworth found in his travels, his investigation of labor practices, I want to read a passage from the book. In this particular passage, he calls out the so-called Southern aristocracy as a falsehood and shares his takeaways from these interviews conducted with Louisiana plantation owners. It's a damning indictment. So let's get into it. Here's Reverend Chaplain Hepworth on his mission for Major General Nathaniel Banks. Hepworth says, "The fact is, there is no such thing as an aristocracy in Louisiana, except such as exists in every community, and it is based on money. As is every other state in the Union, there is a small clique who look upon their ancestry with pride, and a literary clique composed of men who belong to the learned professions, men who have made their mark as authors or statesmen, and a larger clique composed of the landowners who have a firm footing on a large pile of money. If I have rightly classified the people of the state, and ex uno disque omnes, I am sure it will be seen that there is no ground for this grand din about the Southern gentleman. No falsehood is more palpable than this, which has been iterated and reiterated in the Southern church, in Southern literature, in every political speech, until at last, when the war broke out, it showed itself in the opprobrious epithets which were cast upon the Northern character. It has been a habit for years for them to give and for us to receive such insults. And yet, if you would find a man who, for the sake of the money he can make, will resort to the very meanest of measures, will buy poor bacon to feed his 200 hands, withal keep them short on allowance, while he gives extra pay to an overseer to see that their backs are well scored if they do not work. You need not go to the money-loving North. The men of New Orleans will gash their consciences as deeply as will the men of New York. Up the river, down the river, and far in the inland parishes, you will find honorable men of good family who will resent an insult to their personal honor with sword or pistol, who yet are knowingly, willfully, and inhumanely cruel to their hands in order to get a large crop. They cheat the Negroes out of their food and out of their clothing. They use the whip with infernal license, and all for dollars and cents, and at the same time sneer at your prudence and mine as evidence of stingy souls. These very men, when you call on them as a friend, will bring from the cupboard their rich wines and charm you by their conversation as they tell you that their slaves do just as they have a mind to, and that they are losing money on them every year, but keep them because they love them next to their own children. They're lying to you all the while. They, in fact, are lying systematically. And if you will take the pains to go into the slaves' cabins at night, you will find out how much these men love their slaves and how much the slaves love their owners. I have heard all this rhetoric of the planter, and at first I believed it. I began to think that slavery was really a patriarchal institution, that the owner was a kind of father to all his people, feeding them and clothing them and caring for them tenderly when they were ill. But one day, after I had listened to a long chapter of this kind, I was driving out of the gate when I was stopped by a mulatto girl who held something in her hand, which she evidently wanted me to examine. I reined up the horse when she put into my hand a thick iron ring, which she had been compelled to wear about her ankle until it had made a festering sore. 3 others who knew our mission came up, and one showed my friend Wheelock his bare back, which was cut and gashed by the lash that had been applied only 2 days before. And I said, a Southern gentleman, a man who despises money, will after all lie. I afterwards found this to be universally true. You may talk with a planter upon almost any subject, and you will find him affable and gentlemanly. He will scorn to misrepresent an event and will speak with commendable charity of his neighbors. The moment, however, the conversation edges toward slavery, his demeanor changes. He either grows reticent and refuses to say a word, or else becomes angry and openly insults you on the spot. There is no such thing as a calm discussion of the subject with him. He seems to think that any assertion, true or false, is fair. If he can adduce facts, he will pile them up until at last you begin to think the best thing the Almighty can do is to get up an extra generation of Negroes for the use of the Southern sugar planter. If the facts are not readily handled, he hammers away at the Old Testament, quoting verse after verse, trying to prove that the venerable book has no higher mission than to afford favorite texts for the slaveholder. If you suggest that the thraldom of a race impedes civilization and is an inhumanity done to the enslaved, he harangues you on the value of the institution as a missionary society. It has elevated a whole people from the depths of barbarity to the stocks, the lash, and the adulterous bed of the overseer, as the numerous mulattoes on every plantation will testify. I could not help saying one day, as I listened to one of these special pleaders, "Not a slave has been whipped on this plantation for over 2 years." He replied in a tone of offended dignity, "The whip was abolished long ago. My slaves will all tell you that they are happy and contented. I have told them over and over again that if they wish to leave the place, they can do so at any time." Lies from the Southern aristocracy. So there you go. This is the work of Chaplain Hepworth, first of the 47th Massachusetts Infantry, later on the staff of Major General Nathaniel Prentice Banks, a damning indictment of the Southern aristocracy, the so-called Southern aristocracy in Louisiana, keeping in mind what I just read to you and the rest of the book came out at the end of 1863, right in the middle of the war and within the first year of the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. By the way, Hepworth, after the war, went on to serve as a pastor in New York City, later became a Trinitarian, which relates to the belief in the doctrine of the Trinity. Hepworth left the ministry in 1885 to work as a journalist for the New York Herald and authored numerous books. He died in 1902 after a long life of service. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.